Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mccarthy. This is a special series of how to talk policy and influence people. And today I'm very happy to be joined by Jennifer Hough from Alcohol Action Ireland. Thanks for being with me today, Jennifer.
Thanks for having me, Jane. My pleasure.
So, Jennifer, before we get into your very interesting career in journalism and now as policy and advocacy officer with Alcohol Action Ireland, maybe you can just tell me a bit about yourself and your background, please.
Sure, yeah. As you said, my name is Jennifer Hough and I am currently Policy and Research Officer with Alcohol Action Ireland. But I guess my background really is in journalism, where I spent more than 10 years working in a wide range of roles in England, Ireland, Canada, and was lucky enough to do a bit of traveling as well to work on kind of international development stories. So I feel really lucky that I had a great 10 years in journalism, but I guess at a certain point I felt like I wanted to transition into other work, and yeah, that's brought me into the field of policy and research, and I guess a little bit of communications, because they're all kind of interlinked these days. Yes. And I feel very lucky to be working with two great organisations, Mental Health Ireland and Alcohol Action Ireland, as my role is part funded through Mental Health Ireland.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah,
very interesting. I didn't realize that, even though I knew you've been talking obviously in the mental health field, but I didn't realize that the role was co-funded. We'll talk a bit more about that in a second.
Sure.
But to go back to your time with journalism, what sort of subject matter were you most interested in yourself?
Yeah, sure. Well, I suppose, like, you know, most people that go into journalism, you go in with a very idealistic view of kind of wanting to change the world, you know. And even though I spent 10 years working as a journalist, I'd say maybe 5 or 6 of those years I was working as the journalist I wanted to be, you know, okay. the campaigning journalist, whether it was writing about, I suppose, in an Irish context, I wrote a lot about mental health issues, kind of people on the margins, like direct provision, children in care, youth justice, kind of racism in Ireland, travellers, people with disabilities. I used to kind of get a bit of a slagging in the Irish Examiner. They used to say, oh God, if there's anyone downtrodden in Irish society, just go to Jennifer and she'll write about it. But you know, the time that I did,
that is to your credit, I would say. But anyway,
yeah. But you know what? When I worked for the Examiner, it was it was an interesting time, but it was also quite a depressing time. Like, all those reports came out. The Ryan report came out. The Murphy report came out. The Roscommon abuse case had happened, and I was actually sent home to cover that, as actually it had happened quite near to where I'm from. So, you know, it was a really kind of depressing time when all of these kind of cases were just kind of stacking up. And now that I look back on them, you know, they're kind of all interlinked. It was kind of these abuses stacked upon people who, you know, people who don't have the agency, or, you know, vulnerable people, whether it was the past, looking back to the Ryan report, the Murphy report, and then, you know, ones that were actually happening right under our noses. And at that time, I wrote a lot about direct provision, and nobody was really writing about direct provision at that time. And it was kind of hard to get those stories into the paper. Like, now we hear loads, you know, people in direct provision have mobilized, they speak out for themselves. Back then, they were very afraid to speak out, you know.
Yes.
And I was very lucky in Cork. I was based in Cork for the Examiner. I was very lucky to be exposed to people like John Mccarthy. I don't know if you ever came across John Mccarthy yourself, Jane, but he's no longer with us. But he was just the most wonderful, passionate.
White hair in a ponytail. Yes, I met him. Yeah.
So he was just amazing, like, and obviously because he saw that I had an interest in writing about mental health, and he just he made me just look at things through a totally different way. And he was talking about trauma-informed care before anyone was, you know, really. He was just talking about, like, these are people in distress, they're traumatized. Why are we locking them up? Why are we putting them into hospital environments and dosing them with medication? And so he really made me, like, challenge the status quo and look at, you know, the medical model of mental health, and he really educated me as to what was going on and put me in touch with people who I suppose in their own words were being abused by the mental health system, services, you know, not necessarily like by people, but by the system. And you know, there was one case that really stood out. I was just looking back at some old articles. It was the case of John Hunt. It was a man in Cork who, young enough man, but had been locked in a secure unit in Cork for like 5 years, just dosed out of his mind on medication. And his partner at the time was really advocating for him, but obviously he needed help, but the help was that he was just locked away, like, and you know, it was yeah, as I say, it was really lucky that I was exposed to people like that. And of course there's the Critical Voices Network in Cork as well, and I remember going to their first conference and just being kind of just blown away by, you know, hearing about this other side. Like we're so I think we're a little bit brainwashed in that we just accept this kind of medical model of mental health services. You know, people are labeled schizophrenic, bipolar, all this kind of thing. And I went to this conference and there was people and they were like talking about, oh, well, we hear voices and we're part of the Hearing Voices Network and that's what we call it. And I was going like, yeah, that just makes, you know, it's so awful to label and stigmatize people and just put them on medication and forget about them. So obviously that was an area that I became really passionate about and wrote a lot about during my time with the Examiner.
Super. And you mentioned the kind of early I suppose, desire and intention to be a campaigning journalist, but for 4 of those years at least you were doing maybe other things that were less exciting. Did you consciously seek to influence policymakers, Jennifer, you know, in your articles?
Yeah, I was thinking a bit about this, and I guess, like, you know, obviously as a journalist your job is to write about issues that are, you know, social justice issues, depending on what your preference is. But for me, I felt that I was writing about issues that needed to be highlighted and that were important, and that, you know, I don't think I necessarily thought at that time who I was trying to influence. I guess I was quite young. I was kind of maybe a little bit naive in that respect. But looking back on it, you know, obviously I was trying to influence change. But I think as a journalist, you know, maybe you're only one part of a cog that can influence change. Like, you know, like you need people to tell their stories, you need campaigners, you need political will to, you know, in any law reform or social justice change battle, you need all of these things to kind of come together. Did I want to see change? Did I really care about what I was writing about? For sure, like, you know, definitely. But and there was always kind of an eye on the political landscape, you know, as a journalist. I guess you would always be trying to get politicians interested in your cause, or sometimes the politicians would come to you if they knew that you had an interest in a certain topic. So definitely, and civil society too would have been aware of my reporting. And, you know, oftentimes you might be cited in the Dáil or like in a press release by a politician and you'd go, oh wow, this is really exciting, like something's going to happen. But of course, maybe it didn't, you know. Did I influence change? I don't know, like probably not, like, but did I highlight issues and raise awareness about them? Yeah, for, you know, I think, and that is part maybe of trying to influence change.
Sure.
You know?
Well, I was talking yesterday to a man called George Hosking, who is the CEO of Wave Trust. And at the end of our interview, I was kind of saying, well, what can people do, you know, if they're interested in, say, preventing child abuse and neglect, what can they do? Should they write to their politicians and policymakers? And he was saying, well, yes, absolutely, but we need to get the media on side, because politicians are hugely influenced by headlines, particularly headlines on the front page of a newspaper. That will get discussion going in the Dáil if there hasn't been discussion on these issues previously. So for sure we can't ignore the role of the media, and sometimes you know, we're more comfortable talking, I guess, about the immediate crisis. Like obviously everything now is COVID-19 and the pandemic. There are a handful of articles about the people on the margins and the abused children and the women living with domestic violence and all of that. But we kind of forget the underlying issues that just don't go away. But Jennifer, then why did you decide to leave journalism?
Yeah, well, I guess like a little bit kind of what you're saying there, like it can become really hard to write about what you want to write about, and to kind of, as you get a little bit older, I suppose you get a little bit more in tune with what's actually going on. And I think I did become a little bit disillusioned, like with journalism, especially when I moved to Canada. I spent like 4 years in the Irish Examiner, and then I moved to Canada, and literally like the industry started imploding around me. Like, you know, there was layoffs, there was this huge kind of industry-wide kind of collapse really over there. And it was a very cutthroat industry, and I really saw another side of it when I was in Canada. Like, I wasn't writing about the social justice issues that I wanted to write about. So I wasn't getting that like warm, fuzzy feeling of, oh, maybe I'm doing something good here, I'm making a change. So really kind of it made me sit down and kind of go, okay, well, where am I going? What am I doing? And actually, I'd always had an eye on this master's in Cork. Funnily enough, I'd written about it for the Irish Examiner when it first started. I think it started in 2011 or 2012. It's the Child and Family Law Masters in UCC. And it covered like all of the areas that I was interested in: mental health, migration, children's rights, youth justice. So I kind of thought, well, that would be just really interesting, apart from anything else. And it might either help me to kind of specialize as a journalist or to move into another field. So I was actually in Canada when I applied for it, and I got a place for it, delighted to get a place. And yeah, really helped me to change career. It was an amazing course, and just kind of helped me to move into that policy space, you know, afterwards.
Sorry there, I had a little visitor popping in to see your child. Okay. Aurora, I'm in the middle of an interview, pet. So you can say hi to Jennifer. Hello. Sorry, hi, Jennifer. Sorry.
What's going on in here?
Apologies, Jennifer. Just 1 second. I'll edit this out. Stop. I'm sure, though, that they were delighted in UCC as well to get you, because it's very valuable to have people with different perspectives and professional expertise. You know, they've sometimes got guards doing these courses, or social workers. So I'm sure some very good discussion in the course.
There was, yeah, no, it was a great mix. Like you say, there was guards, there was social workers, there was a kind of wide range. Guardian ad litem, I think, was there. So to have I think I maybe was the first journalist they'd had. So definitely, it kind of brought a new perspective of things, or a different perspective, and we had some interesting chats and debates for sure.
And so prior to your current role, you spent 2.5 years working in policy research and communications in Oberstown Children Detention Campus, which is Ireland's national facility for young offenders. What did that role entail, Jennifer?
Yeah, and again, I felt really lucky to get that role, and it was really interesting couple of years. So like you say, it was a kind of a multifaceted role. There was a policy aspect to it, which was I guess the organisation just wanted to update all of its kind of policies from a children's rights point of view, and kind of, you know, updating kind of any law reform in the area, and to ensure that it contained all the elements and standards of best practice in terms of youth justice internationally. So that was kind of one of the functions. Then one of the other, I had actually done my dissertation in youth justice for the masters, and I had done it on the crossover between young people in the care and justice systems, which is kind of a really big issue and a really kind of area that I was always interested in. I wrote about for the Examiner too. So one thing that I did while I was in there, it was kind of like a mini research project, I suppose. It's called The Characteristics of Young People in Detention. And from my own point of view, I suppose I was just interested in, because you know, you always hear these things like kind of anecdotally or from older. I think there was a couple of studies done, one in the children court and a few done about the prevalence of children in care in justice. So I was just really interested to see, could we actually put some figures on this and data on this, and really lucky again that I was given the space and the time to do this. So it was kind of like a snapshot of the characteristics of young people, and you've probably seen it, Jane, what came out.
Yeah, just really like, important.
Yeah, just I suppose this is before I'd heard the term like ACEs or adverse childhood experiences, but look back on it now, you can see that they're just off the charts, like in terms of like they've got you know, they've got the substance abuse or misuse themselves. They've got, it's probably in the family. They could be in care. They've a lot of bereavement and loss, whether it was through a parent being in prison themselves, or just death even, or just separation, like family breakdown and separation. So yeah, just huge social problems. And I suppose for me, like, I kind of always known, like from my time in the Examiner, because I did an investigation into youth justice while I was there, and I'd always kind of known that there was huge social problems with these young people. But I think the wider public maybe didn't know or appreciate it as much, or just kind of go, oh sure, like, you know, we don't really want to know about those young people. But for me, it was always like, well, you've got a kid who could be in care one day, and they're like, oh, like, we must do everything to help this young person in care. They're in care, they're so, you know, and then the next day they could be up in court on charges. It's the same young person with the same problems. But once they moved into the justice system, it was kind of like, oh, well, we don't care about them as much anymore.
Our empathy dries up quite quickly
Yes.
once they violate the rights of others, kind of thing. Yeah,
and like very often, like, the offending of these young people, I'm not excusing it, like, obviously, so, you know, there's a lot of wrong done, and there's victims at the other side of this crime, but a lot of it is petty kind of theft, and that's why, like, it's multiple charges, like kids, you wouldn't believe the amount of charges these kids could have. And you know, once they all stack up, then they will eventually result in a custodial sentence. But so a lot of them just have just such trauma, like trauma, and as I say, it just spirals. They spiral out of control, and yeah, so you can really see that in that characteristics piece, which you know, I did it over 3 years, and it was used widely, kind of, I suppose, as an advocacy tool, whether it was with the media, whether it was with politicians, I guess, you know, just to try and bring a better understanding to the very serious issues that, like, these young people are facing. And obviously we did a little bit of work with the media as well, just trying to reframe, I suppose, almost rehabilitate the image, if you like, of the young offender. And we did this, like, kind of campaign. It was called Not Just Language, like, just about the language that's used for young people when they are, as we say, in conflict with the law. You know, there can be some terrible terminology used. So we did a kind of a language guide almost, and that it was appreciated by most journalists, I think, I'd like to think. But obviously you're not gonna, you know, there's
perhaps not the red top so much, but more reputable.
So much. But no, like a lot of people were thankful for it, and kind of going, oh, well, this is great that we can, you know, some journalists were like, this is brilliant, like, I've always known that language was wrong, but now I can actually go to a sub-edit. Often journalists, you know, they don't write the headlines. Journalists don't write the headlines. They can go to a sub-editor and say, well, hang on a second, I've got this guide that says we shouldn't do that. So yeah, so look at the small things, but language matters.
It does.
Really
and
matters.
And did you do anything during that time on kind of rehabilitating the image of Oberstown itself? Because you know, I know that great work has always been attempted there, you know, under difficult circumstances, and the evidence is always evolving as well. You know, it has to be said that, you know, human rights weren't always as elevated as they are now, and even still we're not fully there, and might never be there. It's a progressive realization process in that regard. And in terms of things like inspection and just, I suppose, even this journey of becoming aware about ACEs, first of all, and then kind of learning what is trauma and how does it change us, or how does it impact our behavior and our relational style. That's quite new in Ireland, even though it's not new elsewhere. It's fairly new. So were you involved at all during your time there in just trying to, again, shift the media or political or advocacy perspective even about what is Oberstown trying to do, and how is it trying to do it with young people?
Yeah, for sure. Like, I guess when I came in, it was following a previous year, a very tumultuous year, where there had been some kind of very public kind of issues on the campus. I won't go into them now, people can Google and find them. But so it was quite a time when they did very much, the organisation wanted to try and put out the other, or the real side. Like obviously that was a point in time, bad things happened, and they were really very much trying to move on from that. And like worked very closely with, or not closely, I suppose, tried to advocate in the media, and definitely got some around the model of care, the key hop model of care, education, health, offending behaviour, preparation for leaving is the 5 kind of pillars of the model of care of Oberstown. So we definitely got some really positive, I wouldn't say really positive, balanced articles into the media where, journalists came on site, whether it was the Irish Times or the Examiner. Cormac O'Keefe from the Examiner did a great piece, really balanced piece. And it was just about kind of, beating that steady drumbeat of kind of positive stories that actually this is an organisation that's really trying to make a positive difference for these young people. Yes, there's been issues, but the very best is going in to try and achieve better outcomes for these young people. And I think there definitely was a shift over the couple of years that I was there. Like I said, we got some really some positive coverage about initiatives such as, like, there was a campus council set up to hear the voices of young people. A participation strategy was I was involved in writing the participation strategy for hearing the voices of young people, and did a little bit of work with the campus council initially. So kind of convened young people, and they had their own council where they would raise issues and talk about them. So there's so much positive stuff going on. There's always it was a funny place in that, like, you could have Michael D. Higgins in presenting Goshka awards to young people on one side of the campus, and you could have something maybe going on on the other side where there was an alarm going off. So it really was a place of like extremes almost, but on the positive and the negative. But really what the staff there are certainly trying their best, and everyone there is trying to create a culture that is committed to better outcomes. So I think they should be supported and lauded. It's not easy work. It's very difficult.
Sure. And it's very important work, I think. We can forget actually that the quality of people that we need to work with some of our most traumatized boys and girls in the country needs to be supported in the work that they do as well, and
really very much
supervision and their own mental well-being and physical safety and all of that. Was there anything, Jennifer, that you actually learned that you didn't already know, I suppose, about young people with offending behaviour from that time at Oberstown?
Yeah, I guess I saw, I saw the real resilience of them and kind of the potential of them, in really awful circumstances. Like, I suppose the real tragedy of the whole situation and the point that they're at is that, like, all of these resources are kind of being pumped into them when things are really serious and maybe have gone so far that, like, you don't know kind of where to start. Like and I hear people kind of going, oh God, look, it's awful, all the resources they have out there at Oberstown, you might hear, and it's going, but sure, like, this is their last chance now, like, and yes, they do have brilliant services, and yes, they definitely should have them earlier, but in an ideal world, all of this would be preventative work, but this is their last chance. They have to try. If you don't try, like, at that point, I mean, you may as well. I think really in Ireland we do have a very good youth justice system, like, compared, like, I spent some time in the US, and just the way they lock up kids and like,
write them off completely.
Yeah. Oh God, yeah. They're in jail. Like, there's no rehabilitation here. It's like, so I think we do the right thing, and there's a lot of resources and money that goes into it. But if it saves lives, like, and it can change lives and trajectories. Obviously, there's some that it doesn't. Like, I was in the Midlands prison recently for my work with Alcohol Action, and I saw a guy that had been in Oberstown, and he recognized me straight away, like, and we had a chat and stuff, but it was just so sad. It was so sad to see him there, and he was someone who, you know, shouldn't be there, and because he, you know, just had such a traumatic background and different things happened to him along the way. But I guess you're not going to save everyone, but
no. And the unfortunate thing is, I'd say 10 of the 12 men I interviewed for my own PhD had spent time in youth detention, whether it was Oberstown, Finglas, St. Michael's back in the day, you know, or St. Pat's. And some of them now were in their late 30s and 40s. So it's absolutely, the earlier we can intervene, like if we can intervene when they're tiny, you know, and support families and moms and communities, and kind of build healthy relationships at the earliest possible stage. But we shouldn't give up when they're 40 either, because the trauma, the trauma wounds from childhood are the same, and we're not engaging enough with them in that regard. So Jennifer, in your current role then with Alcohol Action and the mental health focus, what are your main areas of work there?
Yeah, so I guess we've a few different areas of work. Obviously, like I was saying to you, the role is joint funded with Mental Health Ireland. So that's really just to try and make stronger links and put a stronger focus on the real links between alcohol harm and mental health. And, you know, it sounds like a no-brainer when you say it, but there hasn't really been much focus, like from a I suppose policy research perspective on this, or there hasn't been enough, if you like, because you know, definitely we see it from you know, from the cradle to the grave, how alcohol impacts on mental health. So one of the big things with Alcohol Action Ireland is that we're advocating for is, obviously we're advocating heavily for the urgent implementation of the Public Health Alcohol Act. This is legislation that we've had for a few years now, and people might think it's all done and dusted, but actually the main parts of it haven't actually been implemented. So we would always be advocating around that. One of the other things that we're quite strong in is a childhood free from alcohol harm. And I suppose some people think of children and alcohol and they just think teenage drinking, but actually this is kind of much stronger and more focused than that. While it does include that, it includes like children who are living in homes where there's parental alcohol misuse. And obviously, you know, this is recognised internationally as an adverse childhood experience. And we know that from research that there's at least 200,000 children right now in Ireland that are living in these homes. And there's 400,000 adults who have, you know, we say the adult children. So that's 600,000 people at least in Ireland who
I'd say at least.
You know, at least, exactly. So we've got an initiative called Silent Voices that really tries to advocate around this area. So we're really interested in the trauma-informed approach to services, and we've been doing a little bit of advocacy around that at the moment. And we just think it's so important that this issue is brought to the fore, because it really is a hidden harm, and actually choose to call it hidden harm. And they do have a policy document around it and a strategy around it. But we would think we would be advocating for more, and for services for people who've been impacted in this way. And and the harm like goes across the lifespan. Like as we say, the kids in Oberstown, obviously that's a very extreme end of the scale. But you could have young people who, you know, they end up in mental health services, they end up you know, God knows where they end up in other services, and it's not really, the underlying trauma isn't recognized until maybe they're in a very serious situation, you know. So, and even then is it recognized, who knows. But yeah, we're just really trying to, I suppose, change Ireland's unhealthy relationship with alcohol. Now, that's obviously a huge cultural...
It is a massive cultural ask, but it is very important, because we are famous the world over for excessive drinking. You know, it's an ugly trope, but there's truth in it, you know, that, you know, we kind of half pride ourselves some of the time in the amount of alcohol we can drink, our ability to party and that type of thing. But in terms of the current pandemic and the fact that people now can't go to the pub, but are stressed. You know, we're all stressed. We're all a bit on edge, worried for the future. Maybe people have lost their jobs. They were already maybe, you know, in a delicate situation themselves, but now children can't escape the house. They're stuck at home. Are you concerned, Jennifer, and are your colleagues concerned for the impact that lockdown and unhealthy drinking habits, and perhaps combined then with domestic violence, neglect, you know, emotional abuse, because these things all mount up. It's often not just the alcohol abuse, it's the dose effect of the adverse childhood experiences coming together.
We're hugely concerned actually in Alcohol Action Ireland and Mental Health Ireland. We are really concerned about young people and older people too being locked into homes where there's a lot of drinking going on. And because one of the huge things that maybe people don't often recognize around alcohol is, you know, it's not just your own intake, it's actually the harm to others. And you know, we might say, well, you know, you can do what you want to yourself, but and we don't agree with that either. Like, people should get the right help they need, but it's the harm to others, it's the harm to children. You know, it could even be parental child to parent kind of abuse. We've heard some of those cases, but really the children, for sure, there's no school, there's no, you know, all their clubs, their sports, their networks are just gone. And we're just kind of really concerned about what the after effects of this are going to be. For, you know, the trauma, I guess we're all going to be traumatized now as a nation. I keep going back to this concept, and ourselves and Mental Health, Alcohol Action Ireland and Mental Health Ireland released a position paper about this last week, just kind of calling on any new government to really consider funding and investing in trauma-informed services. And that just means that all frontline services are aware that the people that they are dealing with are going to be coming from, or could be coming potentially from, especially in mental health services, obviously, they're always coming from a position of trauma. And to me, the fact that mental health services aren't trauma informed is just ludicrous. But anyway, that's a whole other conversation. But we're really concerned. And that's what we have a campaign at the moment. It's One Kind Word and One Kind Act. And it's just a social media campaign just to kind of say to people, you know, just think about that child who, you know, everybody, not everybody, but a lot of people might have a niece or a nephew, or, you know, some young person that's in a situation that they might just go, oh God, like, just to even pick up the phone or to give them phone credit, or One Kind Word, One Kind Act, you know, it could just make a bit of it.
Being thought of.
Exactly, that you're not alone, and that, like, it is a small comfort, but it's a comfort. I think it would be a comfort for a young person to kind of know, well, there's someone I can reach out to. One good adult. It's the concept of one good adult, I guess. So look, it's going to be, who knows how long more this is going to go on, and when kids can go back to school, when they can get back to normal, and what the kind of, you know, the outcomes are going to be after that. Like, TUSLA, I'd imagine, is going to need, like, additional capacity, additional funding. The core, you know, the Carol Coulter from the Childcare Law Reporting Project has been raising concerns. Everybody is really concerned. So I think it's really important that government responds in a coherent and cogent way to what's going to be coming down the tracks.
And frankly, that is a point again where anyone with any interest in children who are currently vulnerable, because they're all vulnerable. Well, we're all vulnerable right now, but not equally so. And it does depend on the capacity of the adults in children's lives to buffer them in this tricky time. And if they are under stress and distressed and traumatized themselves, that trauma is probably going to seep sadly into the children. So schools are also going to have a big role to play in this, aren't they, Jennifer? And doctors, you know, because once children are presenting, let's say, with behavioral issues and maybe being earmarked for ADHD or other behavioral diagnoses, we need to ask a few questions maybe, don't we?
For sure. And like that's another bugbear of mine, is that we rush to kind of pathologize what are our normal human like reactions and behaviors following trauma. You know, why are we, it's going to be concerning to see if someone goes to their GP and is X, Y, and Z. Are they going to be just given an antidepressant? And I'm not blaming GPs, but very often that's the only kind of recourse that they might have for someone, that's because they don't have access to, if you refer to someone to psychology, it could take months and months and months. So it could be like a stopgap, put them on the antidepressant or the sleeping tablet or the benzo or whatever it is. And, we can't be pathologizing human behavior. Like, we have to sit down and talk, like people
be
talk.
Curious.
Yeah, and like for children, for schools, like you say, so important. Like, we very strongly would be advocating that schools become trauma informed, and that teachers are given the tools, and also the kind of so that they can have a resource where they can refer someone on. Like, I think teachers, and I don't blame them, they're probably like, they're saying, well, if we now have to recognize that there's something wrong with this child, like, what are we going to do? We're not qualified to deal with this. We need somewhere that they can go, and there isn't any kind of robust places for most. Like, obviously some would have better access to maybe things like Jigsaw. I'm sure Jigsaw are going to be like overrun when all this is and plays out. But teachers do, I think, need to be involved and need to be able to recognize and identify. Obviously they're not going to be able to counsel the young person or to provide professional support in that respect, but to identify and recognize is huge.
And also, I think if we have training provided as a matter of course, really, for anyone has anything to do with children or vulnerable adults, that trauma does things to the brain and body, or can do, especially if we don't have a buffering adult to help us make sense of our experience and to say, you're not to blame, you did nothing to deserve whatever happened to you, and to understand that the challenging behaviors, maybe the self-harming behaviors, the excessive drinking, the drug taking, those are attempts at a solution. They're what the person thinks makes me feel a bit better in dealing with this. They're harmful.
Self-medication.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And in terms of naughty or bold behaviors in the classroom acting out, they have a communicative function. They're saying, I'm frightened, I'm terrified, I am not safe in this world. And that maybe if teachers have the knowledge about trauma and the window of tolerance and how relationships are what cause a lot of the harm, but they're also what help with healing, that they might know, what, I have a role to play here, that I can be there a little bit more for this small vulnerable child who's wrecking my head, but isn't really trying to.
That's like, look beyond the behavior, why, ask what, it's that classic thing of ask what happened to you rather than what's wrong with you. Like, it's these things just sound so simple, don't they, when you talk about them, and it's kind of crazy if an alien came down from another planet and you kind of had to sit down and explain these things, to be going, what? But sure, that makes total sense. It's a no-brainer. Like,
it is a no-brainer, but I think a lot of the resistance to trauma-informed or responsive anything is, what do I do with the information? If someone tells me X, Y, or Z, then what do I do? Whereas actually a lot of the science is just by listening and validating, that is an intervention in and of itself. That is accepting the person and going, I believe you. That is healing in a little way. And then, yes, maybe people need referrals, but just actually, like Bruce Perry, who I adore, and I think the child psychiatrist and neuroscientist says, it's the patterned, repetitive, respectful, reliable relationships that really heal, rather than the 1 hour a week session with a professional. The teachers actually have so much more of a role to play than they realize, but they're currently unequipped. I think they don't know enough about the subject matter to really feel like they're competent, I think, to deal. And also some people are maybe afraid of having to make referrals to TUSLA, and what will that mean? and being in care is an adverse childhood experience in and of itself. So it can be tricky and frightening for people, I suppose.
People are sometimes do want to just, it's easier to look away, I suppose. And another really nice line that I like from, I think it was from Scotland, is that, you know, not everybody needs to be an expert in trauma, but trauma needs to be everybody's business.
Yes.
You know, and isn't that what it is really? It's just, it's, as you say, the recognizing the, maybe the one kind word, the believing, and just the human empathy, like, isn't it? Like, it's like to always go back to John Mccarthy, used to say, like, people in distress, they need love, they need kindness, they need empathy. What are we doing here? Like, you know,
and mentioning love there, I interviewed David Stanton recently, who's currently the Minister for State in the Department of Justice and Equality, and I think he's a very kind, decent man, actually. He mentioned love specifically within the context of the youth justice strategy. Wow. I think was pretty exciting. Amazing. Because it's not language we associate with politics or men or policy makers, and it is exactly what we all need, really, to feel safe in the world and to make amends where we haven't had those things in the past, I suppose. Jennifer, what aspects of public policy would you most like to see urgent action on, and why?
Yeah, I guess, well, with my AAI hat on, I would have to say that we need urgent implementation of the Public Health Alcohol Act. Like this, I don't know if you know much about the history of the legislation, but it was kind of lobbied very heavily from all angles, vested interests, the industry. They don't want this legislation, you know, things like warning labels on alcohol, things like advertising to be regulated. And just as like with tobacco, like a huge global, this is a global kind of fight. And we all know, like, the tobacco industry fought until the very end. And it's the same playbook with alcohol. And it's money, it's business, it's vested interests. But, you know, we should be really, like, a lot of people call us the nanny state and all that, but I hope that COVID has given people like a new understanding of kind of public health and public health measures and what they mean and how important they are. And it's not about being the nanny state, it's about kind of just, it's about, sometimes it's about like fighting vested interests. And yeah, okay, you might be kind of putting regulation around a product that people maybe don't want regulated, but it's a harmful product. Like, look at tobacco now, we all just accept that we can't see cigarettes when you go into a shop, there's no advertising. It's a complete turnaround from what it was like when we grew up. You know, there was the advertising, you could smoke anywhere, and now someone lights up a cigarette and you turn around and you go, what are they doing? Like, get out of my space. Obviously, like, there's a difference between the two products, but in terms of regulation, there is the fight that the industry will put up is the same. So that's my AAI hat, and now I'm going to kind of go to my mental health space, which is where I'm very passionate also. And I just think the mental health services, just, oh my God, where do you even start? Like, we need a complete, like, radical, like, overhaul of how we deal with people in distress. And you know, it's just what we do, I guess. Obviously, you've got the recovery, you know, recovery is a very strong theme now in mental health, and that's great, but it's kind of tinkering around the edges. Like, we can't be putting people into hospital when they're like crying out just to be like nurtured and loved and helped and
heard.
You know,
heard. Half the time they've never been heard by the health professionals.
Exactly. And their story, like, you know, their story, like, I often talk to people about the mental health services, and they kind of look at me like I've got 10 heads, like, and you know, because we're so brainwashed. It's like, oh, someone's got a mental health problem, they need to go into like psychiatry, you know, under the care of a psychiatrist, they need medication, they need to go to hospital. I'm like, no, that is exactly the opposite of what they need, because they don't get, as you say, they don't get heard. Their story won't get heard. Like, people, I tell people, oh, you go into a mental health service, they're not going to ask you, did anything happen to you in your childhood? They're not going to ask you what happened last week. They might just want to, well, they want to know about what brought you there, and the, you know, the immediate crisis. But it's all about medication. It's all about medication. You know, that is the service.
Big pharma, again, as a lobbying entity in terms of the DSM. and the ICD-11, the fact that, for example, complex PTSD only became a diagnosis in 2018. It's still not a diagnosis in the DSM. And that's important for insurance in the United States. You can't get cover for certain treatments, you know, somatosensory treatments or things that aren't medication based, because one, there's no research into these type of studies, or much less research, and two, it's just the default position is some kind of tablet or combination of tablets.
Guinea pigs, people are guinea pigs, and you know, like you and I kind of will know that the science will say pseudo, you know, behind psychiatry, like there is none.
Yes.
And when I say to people, like, they again, I said, they look at me like I have 10 heads, and I'm like, no, there's no, these tablets, yeah, they might work for someone, like in a certain sense, but it's not getting, they might work in a way that they lift a mood or whatever they're doing at that particular moment in time, but it's not solving what's going on. It's just a crutch. It's a kind of a patch up job, you know. And you know, there is, you know, the whole movement around sometimes it's called anti-psychiatry, post-psychiatry. There's people like Dr. Pat Bracken, who is a psychiatrist himself and who is very critical of psychiatry from within. And you know, it's just this patriarchal kind of model that goes back to, you know, the times of the asylums, and it was when the doctor just wrote his prescription and that was it, like. And you know, it's really sad to see the power that it has, and the way people are just kind of, I suppose, in their own words, like abused through this, and they are traumatized, further traumatized by this system, and they don't even recognize it until maybe they can come out the other end and find a different way. And for a lot of people, they don't or won't or can't, because how could you when you've been told maybe from a young age that you've got a chemical imbalance in your brain, and if you take this tablet you'll be fine and you go on with your life, and then to be kind of told actually that's just complete, like, made up stuff, that's not and it just challenges, like, it challenges everything we kind of believe in, because you've got, it's a state, it's a function of the state, and it's telling you this is the treatment you need. I'm a psychiatrist, I'm, you know, very qualified, eminent person, and I'm telling you this. And then to kind of try and I suppose, educate people on that's really, really hard.
You're right. And also it's such, the power dynamic there is enormous. I mean, it is like the criminal justice system in that regard, except I think once you have got a diagnosis of some disorder, you're very easy to undermine ever after that, you know, by the system. And so, and by your family as well, if they've been part of the problem, you know, if they've helped create the trauma, well, once you've the diagnosis, you're the unstable one and you're having another episode. So the fact that we systematically consign the person's voice to the darkest closet in the attic, you know, and don't excavate what might have happened is extremely remiss. And yet there's all kinds of societal interests, I suppose, in keeping it that way, because you know, Sandy Bloom, who's a psychiatrist who set up the Sanctuary model in Philadelphia in the 90s, and it was her colleague Joe Foderaro who came up with let's not ask people what's wrong with them, but ask what happened, because once they did, the kind of the truth erupted out of people. And in fact, they'd been telling them all along as well. They'd been giving fragments of stories and no one had noted it.
Because they were mad when they were telling the story. They were probably in psychosis or maybe, you know, in an episode, and that's when it kind of can come out with people like that, you know. But you know, I suppose, it's tragic, really. It's just a tragedy, and I suppose I only, like I say, came to it 10 years ago, and I've been trying to kind of educate people here and there, but it's just it's a little bit soul destroying, like really the whole thing. And but like you look to Norway, I think they have a hospital now with no medication, a kind of a psychiatric hospital, not called psychiatric, but it's for people in distress, and they're, you know, that's a pilot where they're trying with no medication. But as you say, medicate, you know, it's all tied up with money and big pharma. The same with big alcohol. Big pharma is the same. So if you're going to say, oh, people don't need medication for their mental health anymore, well, I don't, you know, there's no money in that, is there? There's
well,
no
Bessel
money.
van der Kolk as well is interesting on meds. He says that, you know, they can be very good for bringing someone from out there, you know, in extreme distress or psychosis back here, so that they can be present in the moment. But as you say, they don't do anything to help the underlying root causes of the distress.
Yeah, they have a place in a crisis, and for a certain period to stabilize someone. They do. Certainly not advocating that people go off their meds or anything like that. And they would, and that's the other tragedy, is that sometimes people do want to come off them, but it's very difficult to come off them in this, you know, like you.
Well, side effects, I suppose,
Yeah, and I remember a girl one time in Cork, actually, I wrote about, her name was Michelle Dalton. Hi, Michelle, if you're watching. She was just like inspirational. She had been diagnosed as schizophrenic and had, you know, all the horror stories and the meds and the drug, you know, awful story. But she had come out of it herself, you know, she'd found another way. She had kind of had this epiphany, and she found good people, and she found another way. And I remember she rang me up one day, and she was like, I was just at my doctor's and my GP, and I got him to write a letter to say I'm not schizophrenic anymore, or, you know, I'm not schizophrenic. And she's just like, that's like, it's such a horrible label for anybody. And so she was just like delighted that she had this letter, and she was like, oh, and it was like, just.
But she was never schizophrenic. It's the most.
No, like, what even does that mean?
Yeah.
You know, what even does that, like, going back to the, just like these labels, like labeling is just so damaging. Like, it's you know, they stay with people.
They
these
do.
labels.
And for women,
talk about recovery.
The one that really seems to be so pejorative, that I only learned about through the Critical Voices Network, really, was borderline personality disorder for women, which again really means complex trauma, a horrendous history of abuse and neglect, and possibly child sex abuse, and then that people adopt these maladaptive coping strategies and behaviors that get them further abused and rejected by the A&Es and by the helping professionals. So Jennifer, to conclude then, in the mental health field, do you think one of the first things we really need to do is whole-scale trauma training for absolutely everyone who's training to be a doctor, a nurse, a mental health practitioner, psychologist, psychiatrist, the works?
Yeah, for sure. Like, it's just, again, it's the concept of a no-brainer. Like, you know, sometimes I you know, with social workers or GPs or whoever would say, oh, we didn't get trained in addiction or X, Y, and Z. And it's like, what do you mean you didn't? And so now it's trauma. It's, where is all this hurt and this behavior coming from, and why? So, like, yeah, I think that everyone needs to be, and it's got, like, you know, we might say, people might listen to this and think that we're very pie in the sky, but it's happening in Scotland, and it's so great to have a jurisdiction that's very nearby and that's got a similar population and similar problems, and they are doing it. They have like a national training plan for trauma for all frontline services, and they're rolling it out and they're doing it. So, like, we can do this, you know, we really can.
Absolutely. They're inspirational in Scotland. But the other thing about the ACE Aware Nation movement and the move towards trauma responsive care and practice is that the ordinary woman and man on the street have a role to play as well. And that's where your one kind word thing comes in. It's about kindness and compassion, and we don't all have to become trauma experts, but we do need to realize that when we're confronted by aggressive and self-harming or otherwise challenging behaviors, they're coming from a place of woundedness.
Oh, yeah.
And if only we can try and be a little bit more patient and kind and nice and compassionate and try for a second to put ourselves in their shoes, then, you know, we can actually be transformative ourselves just through these small little moments. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, for sure. Like, I mean, yes. And hopefully as we move to kind of our new world post-COVID, we're going to have a new world, don't you know? And that we all, like, because we all, you know, everybody's going to have a little bit of like anxiety. I've been speaking to friends even who, you know, would never have an anxious day, and all of a sudden people are anxious, and because everything that they knew was taken away from them. And so like everybody is hopefully going to have a little bit of an insight actually into what it's like to feel anxious and worried and scared and all of those things. So hopefully we'll all be kinder and nicer and more empathetic. That would be great.
Okay, well, I'm hopeful too, Jennifer, because what we've always done has been harmful and hasn't led to safer outcomes for society, let alone the individuals in Oberstown or in prisons or mental health institutions. So we can only hope to be kinder and more compassionate and actually
funding, of course. We need funding for kindness.
Well, we do.
So yeah, look at you've got. I think we look to Jacinta Ardern in New Zealand. She's my favourite world leader at the moment. I think everybody. Yeah. But you know, she had that well-being budget last year where the first ever of its kind, and pumped just so much money into this health, well-being, and mental well-being, and you know, frontline services and trauma informed and all of that. So that's what we need. And Scotland have done it too. Yeah. So we can be next.
Yes. So the next government should fund well-being.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yes, definitely.
Because we bailed out the banks, and for what good, you know, necessarily.
Exactly. Let's bail out our people now when we need it. We all need we'll need a little bit of kindness, well-being, care, like self-care, care of community.
Safety. I think if we prioritize safety first and foremost, then flourishing can follow. But without safety, we can't, because we're stuck in survival then. And too many people right now are really stuck in survival. And so we're going to have to pick up the pieces and prioritize their well-being, I think, when we're done.
Sure.
Jennifer Hough, thank you so much for talking today.
Interesting.
You've done fascinating work so far, and I know you have lots more to do. You've a few ambitious projects there in the works and legislative asks, and hopefully some of the listeners and viewers will jump on the bandwagon and put some pressure on to help with those calls.
Hopefully. We live in hope, Jane. Yes. We live in hope. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, this was
Take care.
Law and Justice with Jennifer Hough in the special How to Talk Policy and Influence series. Thanks so much, Jennifer. Bye-bye.